Thu and Fawn grew up together in a small neighborhood in the heart of the city. Since childhood, they had been inseparable, going to school together, wandering through the narrow alleyways, and climbing rooftops to gaze at the starry night sky. "When we grow up, will you be my wife?" Fawn had once asked, half-jokingly. Thu giggled, playfully punching his shoulder. Who proposes like that? But deep down, she believed that the boy standing before her would always belong to her. At 18, they stepped into the future with bright dreams. Thanh was accepted into a prestigious university while Thu pursued fashion design, nurturing the dream of building her own brand. Though their studies kept them busy, they remained by each other's side. Then one day, Thanh received the news. He had won a scholarship to study in the US. His family was overjoyed, but Thu felt only a heavy weight in her heart. "Are you really leaving?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thanh nodded. "Just 3 years. I'll be back." She smiled, but a vague sense of unease crept into her heart. 3 years isn't long, but it's long enough to change a person. On the day he left, she didn't cry. She stood strong as he hugged her tightly and whispered, "Wait for me." She nodded. After Thanh left, her world felt empty. She buried herself in work, trying to fill the void with designs and projects. But at night, she would unlock her phone, rereading his messages. Words filled with love, giving her strength to hold on. In the beginning, Thanh texted and called frequently. He told her about his life in the US, the initial struggles, and the exciting things he was learning. The distance between them felt insignificant. But then, the messages became fewer. The calls grew shorter, rushed. Thanh was always busy, sometimes going an entire week without reaching out. She reassured herself, "He has so much to handle, I shouldn't bother him." One night she received a text from him. "I'm sorry, I've been really busy, but I still miss you." She stared at the screen, an unfamiliar sense of distance creeping in. Slowly she learned to wait less, to expect less. But no matter what, she held on to her belief. Just 3 years and he would return. And then the day finally came. At the airport, she waited nervously. She wore the blue dress he had once loved, clutching her phone tightly. She imagined him stepping out, seeing her, then running to embrace her like a scene from a romantic movie. But when Thanh appeared, her heart shattered. He wasn't alone. Beside him was a beautiful, confident young woman. They held hands, laughing together as if they were the only two people in the world. Thu froze. She couldn't believe her eyes. Thanh saw her. His expression flickered with hesitation, but only for a moment, before settling into calm indifference. Thanh stepped forward, his voice slightly strained. "Thu, this is Trin, my fiancé." At that moment, the world around Thu crumbled. The noise of the airport faded. The people surrounding her disappeared. All she could hear was the sound of her own heart breaking. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Oh, is that so?" Trin extended a hand, her smile warm, her gaze full of confidence. "Nice to meet you. I've heard a lot about you from Thanh." Thu stared at the outstretched hand. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, but all she could do was take Trin's hand and shake it lightly, her lips pressed together in silence. That night, she sat alone in the darkness of her room. She scrolled through old messages, revisiting promises, reliving dreams that once felt so real. Now, they were nothing but memories. She smiled, but silent tears fell. It turned out she had already lost the moment he boarded that plane 3 years ago. Yet perhaps the most painful part wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing she had believed in something that was never real. The next morning, Thu woke early. She made herself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window, staring outside. The streets were as busy as ever, cars passing endlessly. Inside her, there was only emptiness. 3 years of waiting had led to nothing more than a cold introduction. "This is my fiancé." She didn't blame Thanh. She blamed herself for believing that someone who left could ever return the same, for wasting her youth on a promise that even the one who made it had long forgotten. She told herself to forget him. But how do you forget someone who was once your entire world? Perhaps Thanh understood her turmoil. After returning, he never reached out. No explanations, no messages. She was no longer a part of his life. Time passed. A week, a month, then a year. Thu stopped mentioning Thanh. She buried herself in work, opening a small fashion boutique and focusing on building her own future. Many pursued her, yet she never let anyone in. Then one day, Thanh returned. He stood outside her shop for a long time before finally calling out her name, the way he always had. "Thu." She turned around, momentarily surprised, but her expression quickly turned cold. "What are you doing here?" Thanh looked exhausted, a shadow of the man he used to be. His hair was unkempt, his eyes dark with fatigue. Slowly he spoke. I got divorced." The words fell between them like a blade cutting through the past. Thu didn't know how to react. He was divorced. The woman he had once held hands with at the airport, the one he had proudly introduced as his fiancée, was no longer by his side. She didn't ask why. She didn't care. And yet, somewhere deep inside, an inexplicable ache lingered. Tom let out a sad smile, his voice low. "I know you don't want to hear about my life anymore, but honestly, I have no one else to talk to." Thu remained silent. A strange mix of emotions swirled inside her, somewhere between pity and anger. She wanted to tell him how she had waited for him. She wanted to tell him how much it hurt to see him holding someone else's hand. But in the end, she only gave a faint smile. "And now, what do you want from me?" Tan didn't answer right away. He stared at her for a long moment, as if battling himself. Then, his voice dropped lower. "I need someone to help me take care of my daughter." She froze. He wasn't here because he loved her. He wasn't here because he regretted leaving. He was here because he needed her. That was it. She let out a soft laugh, but it was bitter. "So, after everything, I'm still just a backup choice, aren't I?" Fan quickly shook his head. "I know I don't deserve this, but Han has no mother. I don't want her to grow up without love." Han, she remembered now. Fan and Trin's daughter. A little girl with eyes as clear as the sky after rain, yet somehow distant, as if lost in a world of her own. Thu had only seen her a few times, fleeting glimpses on social media, in those picture-perfect moments of a successful man, a beautiful wife, and a flawless child. A perfect family. A family that had no place for her. And now that picture was shattered, and he had come back to her. Part of her wanted to refuse immediately. She owed him nothing, but another part of her hesitated. Was it because she still loved him? No. She didn't love Tun anymore, but she cared about Han. She knew what it felt like to grow up without love. Hu closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, her voice was unnervingly calm. "All right, I agree." Tun looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. Maybe he thought she would demand something or at least be angry, but she wasn't. She simply agreed. And that was the moment Hu stepped into a marriage without love. She didn't know if she had made the right choice or the wrong one. All she knew was that from this moment on, her life would never be the same. The wedding was rushed. No flowers, no elegant gown, no soft music playing in the background, just a small gathering with a handful of close friends. A marriage certificate signed quickly on a quiet afternoon. Han said little. And Thu, she expected nothing. She entered his home silently, like a stranger seeking temporary shelter. Han stood at the doorway, her big round eyes watching her intently. The child didn't speak. She wasn't curious nor surprised. Thu stepped forward and gave a gentle smile. But the way Han looked at her made her feel as if she were being judged. Han didn't reject her, but she didn't welcome her either. She didn't ask why Thu was there. She didn't act warm. Whenever Thu spoke, she simply nodded or responded with short-clipped answers. Thu knew deep down that to the little girl, she was not a mother, and perhaps she never would be. During the early days of their marriage, she did everything she could to fulfill her role as a wife, as a stepmother. She woke up early to prepare breakfast, washed clothes, cleaned the house, cared for Han as if she were her own child. But the more she tried, the more distant Than became. He was never home for long. Work, outside relationships, unspoken reasons, they kept him constantly occupied. And whenever he did come home, he would exchange a few bland words before retreating to his room. There were nights when Thu sat alone in the living room, staring at the streetlights casting shadows through the window, wondering, what was she even doing here? Was this marriage truly for Han, or was she still clinging to something that had long ceased to belong to her? One morning, she woke up early, carefully preparing breakfast, setting Tan's portion neatly on the table. But when he left for work, he only took a sip of coffee and walked out, without touching the food. Thu quietly cleaned up. That evening, she tried to start a conversation, tried to bridge the growing gap between them, but his replies were short, distant. She understood now. He had never married her for love, nor because he needed someone to share his burdens. He simply needed someone to shoulder the responsibilities he could not. She was nothing more than a substitute. Nothing more. Thun buried himself in work. His late nights became more frequent. Each time he came home, his shirt carried the scent of unfamiliar perfume. His eyes avoided hers. She didn't ask. She no longer cared to ask. The late night calls, the hurried messages he read and deleted, she knew. She knew she was not the only woman in his life. But what hurt her the most was not the betrayal. It was the indifference. And then, one day, disaster truly struck. That day, it rained heavily. Thu was tidying up the house when she received a call from the hospital. An accident, a serious collision. She rushed there, her heart burning with anxiety. When she arrived, Tan was lying motionless on the hospital bed, his face pale. The machines around him emitted steady beeping sounds. The doctor informed her that his condition was critical, severe internal injuries due to a strong impact. She sat down beside him, taking his ice-cold hand in hers. Suddenly, all her anger faded, leaving only an overwhelming sorrow. He was still the Tan of those past years, the one from their youth, from the days when he rode his bicycle through the streets with her on the back seat, from the promises that once seemed eternal. She wanted to say something, but in the end she remained silent. Han stood by the door, her eyes red with tears. For the first time, Thu saw the girl cry. Perhaps, deep inside, Han was just as terrified as she was, afraid of losing the only person she had ever loved, afraid that, after everything, this family would be left with nothing. Thu reached out her hand, and for the first time in years, Han stepped forward and rested her head on Thu's shoulder. In that moment, Thu realized this was the first time in her marriage that she no longer felt alone. 3 days later, Han passed away. Death came faster than anyone could have imagined. His internal injuries were too severe. Despite the doctor's best efforts, he did not survive. That night, Thu sat beside his hospital bed holding his hand tightly. His breath grew weaker, his eyes clouded with only the faintest glimmers of light remaining. "I'm sorry." His voice was so weak it almost vanished into the air, as if each word took all his strength to utter. Thu said nothing. Silent tears streamed down her gaunt face. There were so many things she wanted to ask. If he could turn back time, would he have done things differently? On the day he left her all those years ago, had he ever regretted it? But looking at his lifeless face, she realized none of those questions mattered anymore. He had gone too far to ever return. Han stood in the corner clutching a small teddy bear. Her eyes were empty. She didn't cry, didn't speak. She just stood there, as if unable to believe that the father she had loved more than anything in the world had left her forever. Tan passed away on a rainy night. The cold rain poured over the city, casting a sorrowful gloom over everything. His funeral was simple and swift. Many people came to pay their respects, but soon enough they all returned to their own lives, leaving behind 3 souls with an unspoken grief. After Tan was gone, the house felt eerily empty. Even though he rarely came home when he was alive, at least his presence had been there. A shadow, a reminder that he still existed. Now, only Thu and Han remained. 2 women abandoned by the same man. But loss was not the worst part. What was truly terrifying was the emptiness. After her father's death, Han changed completely. She had always kept her distance from Thu, but now she seemed to withdraw entirely into her own world. She no longer spoke, no longer smiled, and no longer resisted Thu's presence. Thu could feel the child's isolation, like a lone ship drifting aimlessly in the vast ocean, with no one to pull it back. One night, as Thu passed by Han's room, she gently pushed the door open. The girl was curled up at the edge of her bed, staring blankly at a picture of Tan. Han, there was no response. Thu stepped inside and sat down beside her. "Are you okay?" Han turned to look at her, eyes red with tears. "Dad isn't coming back, is he?" Thu felt her throat tighten. No, he isn't. No matter how much pain or deception had existed between her and Than, he was still the only person Han had ever truly loved. And now, that one person was gone, leaving the girl alone in the world. "Your dad loved you very much," Thu whispered, placing her hand over Han's small one. Han bit her lip. Then, for the first time in years, she reached out and held Thu's hand. No more words were needed. They simply sat there in the darkness, holding onto each other as if letting go would mean losing everything. In the days that followed, Thu tried her best to be there for Han. She took her to school, cooked her favorite meals, and quietly removed Dan's old photographs so she wouldn't have to face the pain too soon. But things were not that simple. Tan had left behind a massive debt. His business had not been as successful as she had believed. It turned out he had been borrowing money for years just to maintain the image of a successful man. And now, with him gone, that debt had fallen on her shoulders. She had to choose, sell the house to pay off the debt or struggle to keep everything afloat. She didn't want to lose this place. It wasn't just Tan's house. It was the only place where Han felt safe. But without money, how could they continue living here? Then, out of nowhere, Tan's mother, Madame Huang, who had stayed out of their lives for years, suddenly reappeared with a proposal that left Thu in shock. "You should let Han come live with me." Thu stared at her in disbelief. "What did you just say?" Madame Huang met her gaze, her eyes cold and unyielding. "You are not her biological mother. She needs a real family. A stepmother like you can't give her what she needs." Thu clenched her fists. For years, even though Han had never truly accepted her, she had tried her best to love and care for the girl. And now, when Han was the only thing she had left, they wanted to take her away. "You have no right to do this." Thu's voice trembled. Madame Wang sighed, as if speaking to a stubborn child. "You can keep her if you want, but do you have the means to take care of her? Do you have the money to support her? Or are you planning to let her live in poverty?" Thu was speechless. She knew all too well Madame Wang was using her greatest fear against her. But what Madame Wang said wasn't entirely wrong. How long could Thu take care of Han? She turned to look at the child standing silently beside her, her face filled with uncertainty. "Where do you want to stay?" she asked softly. Han looked up at her, fear clouding her eyes. "I want to stay with you, Mom." A single word, simple, yet it nearly brought Thu to tears. She turned back to Madame Huang, her gaze unwavering. "She's staying with me." Madame Huang pressed her lips together, her eyes cold. "You'll regret this." Maybe, but for the first time in her life, she felt she was doing something right. The days that followed were a constant battle. The debt Han left behind was overwhelming, and she had little choice but to sell the small boutique she had poured her heart into. Even the house was repossessed by the bank. All she had left was just enough money to rent a tiny, run-down apartment in an old alley. But she had no regrets. Han was still here. She still held her hand on the way to school, still called her mom, even if the words sometimes came hesitantly, and that alone was enough to keep her going. But hardship was relentless. The instability of work, the dwindling money, the exhaustion that gnawed at her body. Each night after Han had fallen asleep, Thu would sit silently in the kitchen, staring blankly at the stack of unpaid bills. The cracks were beginning to show. As Han grew older, she became more aware of their struggles. Though she never complained, she started withdrawing into herself. The worn-out clothes, the meager meals, it all made her quieter. Thu noticed, but didn't know what more she could do. Then one day, Han came home late. Thu stood at the door, gripping her phone tightly. When she finally saw the small figure emerging from the dark alley, she rushed over, her voice sharp with worry. "Where have you been? I was so worried." Han lowered her head, her tiny hands gripping the strap of her school bag. "I got a job." Thu froze. "A job? Where?" "At the bakery near school," Han mumbled. "I only help clean up. It's not hard, I promise." Thu's anger dissolved instantly, replaced by a sorrow so deep it ached. She knelt down, holding Han's shoulders. "Why did you do that?" Han looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "Because I don't want you to struggle anymore." Thu stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her into a tight embrace. She had tried so hard to be strong, yet she had let a child worry for her instead. That night, she sat alone in her room thinking for a long time. Maybe it was time to do something. She couldn't let Han live like this any longer. But how? She had lost everything. There was nothing left to hold on to. Then an idea flickered in her mind. Pretend to be insane. A reckless, desperate idea. But if she did it, would Keen, her own son, the one she had raised yet abandoned her in her time of need, come back? Would Vi, her daughter-in-law, allow her to stay in their home even for a little while? Just long enough for her to rest. Just long enough to give Han a better life? She wasn't sure, but she knew she had to try. She had to do everything to protect Han. And so, from the next day, an old senile mother slowly emerged. Thu began to forget things, acting strangely. One day, she poured an entire jar of salt into the soup and giggled as if it were the funniest thing in the world. Another day, she stood in the middle of the house, clapping and singing a long-forgotten children's song. Once, she wandered to the alley entrance and forgot her way home, forcing the neighbors to call Han to fetch her. Word soon reached Kien. A week later, Kien and Vi came to visit her. "The neighbors say you've been acting strange lately. Are you okay, Mom?" Kien asked, his voice filled with doubt. Thu blinked at him, as if trying to comprehend the situation. "Who are you?" Keen's face turned rigid. Thu glanced at her husband, then turned to Thu, her voice sharper. "You're testing us, aren't you?" Thu tilted her head, her eyes vacant. "Who are you?" Keen was truly shaken. He grabbed her hand, his voice trembling. "Mom? You don't recognize me? It's Keen." Thu let out a laugh, her tone innocent. "Keen? My son passed away a long time ago." Keen froze, pain flickering in his eyes. Vi frowned, pulling him aside, her voice low but firm. "She's faking it, but if this keeps up, she's going to cause trouble sooner or later." Keen hesitated. "Mom is old. Maybe she really is senile." And Vi crossed her arms, her voice laced with irritation. "So what are you going to do? Let her stay here and have the whole neighborhood gossip, or send her to a nursing home and be done with it?" The words cut through the air like a blade. Keen remained silent for a long time before finally sighing. "I'll take Mom home with us for now. If things get worse, we'll figure something out." On the day Thu moved in, Han held her hand tightly. "Mom, I'm scared." Thu gently patted her head and whispered, "I'm scared too, but I'm doing this for you." Han's eyes welled up, but she said nothing more. As Thu stepped into what was once her home, she realized how foreign it had become, and she knew the door behind her could slam shut at any moment. In the first few days at Kien's house, she continued her act. She forgot things, did odd things, put spoons in the fridge, poured fish sauce into a teacup, and sometimes sat in the middle of the room muttering to an invisible person. V's patience was wearing thin, and though Kien tried to endure, it was clear he was growing frustrated too. One night, as she cleaned the living room, V snapped. "How are we supposed to live like this? The house is always a mess. Someone has to keep an eye on her constantly. I really can't take it anymore." Kien sighed, glancing at his mother, who was curled up on the couch, her eyes empty, lost in another world. "She's my mother," he said softly. Vi crossed her arms, her voice ice cold. "Then you take care of her. Don't expect me to clean up after her all the time." Helpless, Keen looked at Thu. Once, his mother had been a strong, decisive woman. But now, the woman standing before him was merely a faded shadow of herself. And that was exactly what Thu wanted him to see. Every day, Han still called Thu. "Mom, are you okay?" Thu smiled over the phone. "I'm fine." There was silence on the other end for a long moment before Han softly said, "I miss you." Thu tightened her grip on the phone, feeling a lump rise in her throat. Wait for me, my love. She knew she couldn't stay here forever, but she needed to see where her son's heart truly lay. 2 weeks later, Vi lost all patience. How long are you going to let your mother live like this? If she's really senile, she should be placed in a nursing home. I can't take this anymore. Keen hesitated. His mother had sacrificed her whole life for him. Vi scoffed. Sacrificed? Do you even realize how much she's making us suffer? You go to work all day. You don't have to stay home cleaning up after her, taking care of her. How would you understand? Keen said nothing. After a long pause, he sighed. I'll figure something out. V raised an eyebrow, smirking. You don't have to. I already found a nursing home. All you need to do is agree. The atmosphere in the room grew tense. Keen glanced at his wife, his expression uncertain. At that moment, a voice came from behind them. If you don't want to take care of her, let me. They both turned. Han stood at the door. No one knew when she had arrived, but her eyes held a determination that even Thu hadn't expected. She raised me for years. To me, she is my mother. V laughed mockingly. Oh, that's rich. So my mother-in-law is your real mother now? Han didn't waver. No, she's not my birth mother, but she raised me, and I won't let her be abandoned. Thu looked at the girl, feeling her heart tighten. Even though she had hidden it, the girl had seen. Even though she had never spoken it aloud, the girl had understood. Han turned to Keen. If you don't want to take care of her, let me. Keen was silent for a long time. Finally, he nodded. Do whatever you want. Just don't come back blaming us later. Han didn't respond. She simply bowed, then walked over to Thu, knelt down, and took her hand. Her voice was gentle yet firm. Mom, let me take you home. Thu was taken aback. It wasn't Kian, the son she had raised all these years, but the child she once thought didn't belong to her, who had reached out. She looked at Han, then at Kian and Vi. She had finally found the answer to the final test of her life. Everything was clear now. Tears fell silently down her aged face, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of happiness. Han supported Thu as they walked out. As the door closed behind her, Thu felt as if she had just stepped out of a play she had written and performed for years. No one stopped her. No one even asked her to stay. There was no regret. Only Han, the child she once thought did not belong to her, was the only one to reach out and welcome her. Thu remained silent the entire way home. Han didn't say anything either. It was only when the door of the small apartment closed behind them that Thu slowly sat down, her vacant eyes staring into the void before her. Do you really want to take care of me? Her voice was hoarse. Han set the bags down, sat beside her, and gently took her hand. You are my only family. Those 3 words, only family, sent a strange ache through Thu's chest. Perhaps for the first time in her life, she realized she had never truly been alone. In the early days of living with Han, Thu felt no gratitude for the young woman's kindness. On the contrary, she carried years of resentment and bitterness, pouring them onto Han. She deliberately caused trouble in every way she could. In the mornings, she rummaged through the house, breaking some of Han's most cherished ceramic pieces. By afternoon, she would sit at the front door, yelling at the neighbors, forcing Han to rush out and apologize. On some days, she refused to eat, sweeping an entire meal onto the floor, leaving Han to quietly clean up the mess. Each time, Thu would sit back and narrow her eyes, watching to see how Han would react. But strangely, Han never got angry. She simply picked up the broken pieces, wiped the stains away, and gently asked, Do you want something else to eat? Or are you feeling unwell? Should I make you some orange juice? Han's patience irritated Thu even more. Does she want to act noble? She won't fool me. But day after day, Han's quiet care and unwavering patience began to unsettle her. One night, Thu lay in bed, eyes closed but unable to sleep. My own son wants to send me away, yet the one I despise most is willing to take me in? How twisted is that? Just then, she heard soft footsteps. Han tiptoed into the room, thinking she was asleep. She gently adjusted the blanket over her and let out a quiet sigh. Thu could hear the exhaustion in that sigh, yet there was not a single word of complaint. After a long pause, Han's voice rose in a whisper, as if speaking to herself. You hate me. I know that. You've looked at me differently since I was a child, but for some reason, I still want to stay by your side. Thu remained motionless, but her heart clenched. What is this child saying? Han's voice was still soft, tinged with quiet sorrow. It's okay if you don't see me as your daughter. As long as I can see you as my mother, that's enough. Those words pierced straight into Thu's heart. She had always believed Han was pretending, but there was no way such sincerity could be a lie. For all these years, she had harbored resentment, jealousy, and anger toward this girl. But had Han ever truly done anything wrong? Perhaps her only mistake was being born into this world with a mother who had passed away and a stepmother who could never love her. Thu realized that perhaps the cruelest person was not Kian, but herself. That night, she couldn't sleep. Han's words echoed in her mind, forcing her to confront a bitter truth. She had been wrong, terribly wrong. The next morning, when Han brought a bowl of hot porridge into the room, Thu no longer turned away coldly as before. Instead, she silently took the bowl from Han's hands. In that fleeting moment of touch, she spoke, her voice as soft as a whisper in the wind. "Thank you, dear." Han paused for a second, slightly surprised, then smiled gently. "Eat while it's hot, Mom. It won't taste as good once it cools." Her words were as warm and kind as always, yet Thu could see the surprise in her eyes. She knew this was likely the first time she had ever thanked this girl. Watching Han quietly turn away, Thu felt a deep ache in her chest. How much suffering has this child endured because of me? How could I have been so selfish? From that day on, Thu began to change, little by little. She no longer went out of her way to make things difficult for Han, nor did she lash out at her without reason. Instead, she slowly started to show her care, even if her gestures were clumsy and awkward. One evening when Han returned home late from work, she found a steaming pot of soup waiting on the table. Surprised, she turned to Thu. "Mom, did you make this for me?" Her turned away, her cheeks slightly flushed. "Who else would? You came home late. You must be hungry. Eat before it gets cold." Han looked at her, emotion flickering in her eyes. She said nothing more, simply sat down and took slow, deliberate spoonfuls of the hot soup. It wasn't anything extraordinary, but to Han, it was the most delicious meal she had ever had. In the days that followed, the bond between Thu and Han grew stronger. Neither of them spoke about it, but both knew that old wounds were being replaced with understanding and love. Han never once brought up the painful past. She simply continued to fulfill her role, caring for Thu as if she were her own mother. And though Thu never admitted it out loud, in her heart, she had truly come to see Han as her daughter. For the first time in her life, she felt no regret in staying by this girl's side. And for the first time, she understood love wasn't just about blood ties. It was about kindness, patience, forgiveness. As time passed, Thu's health declined. The aches and pains worsened with each passing season, leaving her unable to care for herself as she once had. Han was always there, cooking, cleaning, staying up countless nights whenever Thu was unwell. One day, sensing that her time was running out, Thu called Han to her bedside. Her frail hand trembled as she grasped Han's, her eyes filled with emotion. "Han, I owe you so much." Han's eyes widened in surprise. She immediately sat down beside her. "What are you saying, Mom? You don't owe me anything. If anyone is indebted to someone, it's me. You raised me all these years." She gently shook her head, her voice weak yet filled with sincerity. "No, my dear, I was wrong. Since you were a child, I have resented you, just because you were Trin's daughter. I was selfish. I always saw you as her shadow, forgetting that you were just a child who needed love." Her aged, clouded eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I made you suffer so much, and yet you never once blamed me. Instead, you took care of me, loved me. I don't know what to say except I'm sorry." Han's eyes welled up with tears. She held her mother's hands tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "Please don't say that, Mom. I have never blamed you. No matter what, you are still my mother." True tried to smile, her gaze soft with peace. Slowly, she reached into the small bedside drawer and pulled out a stack of papers, placing them in Han's hands. "This is my will. I prepared it long ago. I'm leaving everything to you." As my way of saying sorry, Han broke down, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. "I don't need anything, Mom. I just need you." Han gently closed her eyes, a faint smile lingering on her lips. She gave Han's hand one final squeeze before peacefully slipping away, carrying with her the love and forgiveness she once thought she would never receive. In that small, quiet room, Han clung to her mother's lifeless form, sobbing like a child. Yet deep inside, beyond the grief, there was a sense of solace, because in the end, they had truly found each other as a real family. After Thu's passing, Han quietly took care of all the funeral arrangements. Though they were not bound by blood, to Han, she was the only family she had left in this world. On the day of the burial, the sky wept with heavy rain, mourning a life filled with hardship, pain, and a redemption that had come too late. Standing before the grave, incense in hand, Han's tears mixed with the rain as she whispered, "Rest in peace, Mom. I will live well. I will be happy, just as you always wished for me." In the days that followed, the old house Thu had left behind became a silent sanctuary, a place filled with echoes of their past. Han spent her days organizing everything, carefully dusting off old photographs and treasured belongings. Each item she touched brought back a flood of memories. One day, while tidying up, she stumbled upon a small wooden chest that Thu had always kept locked. Inside, she found faded letters, yellowed photographs, and a journal. Curious, she opened it. The pages were thin and fragile, the ink smudged by time, yet the handwriting was unmistakably her mother's. Each trembling word told a story of bitterness, jealousy, and the hidden pain that had haunted Thu's life. But it was the final entry that made Han's breath hitch, her heart clench. "Han, I resented you for so many years simply because I was selfish, but now I see you were the greatest gift life ever gave me. Thank you, my dear. Thank you for not abandoning me, for loving me even when I didn't deserve it. I'm so sorry. Han gently closed the diary, tears falling onto the faded pages. She hugged it tightly to her chest, as if it were the last remnant of warmth left from Thu. After everything, Han made a decision. She left the old house behind, selling a portion of the land Thu had left her, and using the money to open a small cafe in the heart of the city. The cafe carried the essence of Thu: aged paintings, rustic wooden chairs, and delicate porcelain cups worn by time. Han didn't want it to be just a cafe. She wanted it to be a haven. A place of solace where people could find comfort just as Thu had spent her life searching for love. As time passed, Han's cafe grew in popularity. One day, she met Hai, a quiet yet sincere man. He didn't try to impress her, didn't overwhelm her with words. He simply listened. He was a presence of calm, something Han had never truly known before. Their connection blossomed naturally. One evening, Hai gazed at her, hesitation flickering in his eyes. Han smiled gently, as if she already knew what was coming. Breaking the silence, Hai finally spoke. I don't know what the future holds, but there is one thing I'm certain of. I want to share it with you. Will you start this new chapter with me? There was no urgency in his words, no pressure, just sincerity and respect. Han met his gaze. Deep within, she saw gentleness, patience, and the kind of love she had always searched for. A warmth spread through her chest. She swallowed hard before breaking into a soft smile. The smile of someone ready to leave the past behind and embrace what lay ahead. I'm ready. From that moment on, they stepped into a new journey together. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a journey built on trust. Because in the end, Han had learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means setting yourself free. And true love always comes from those who never leave your side. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. A story that is not just about life's twists and turns, but also about love, forgiveness, and the true meaning of family. Sometimes the people we once saw as strangers turn out to be the most important pillars of our lives. If you enjoyed this story, please show your support by liking the video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories in the future. Your support is our greatest motivation to continue bringing you heartfelt and valuable content. With sincere gratitude,